and gay. As I just made mention to the family, walking down that hall and across from the pastor's reception room, countless times I'd see Gene and Gay come in this door over here and start walking to their 8 o'clock Sunday school class, and I'd have a chance to interact with them because they were here before everyone else was, and had a chance to get to say a hello, and it was always sweet to see them come to God's house. Bob shared with me when Gene was in his last days and even in the hospital and heavily medicated that he was working on his iPhone to try to get the services at Lenexa Baptist. So even in his inability to get here and as sick as he was, he still wanted to hear what's going on at church and hear God's word preached again. The church was important to him because Jesus was important to him. And certainly, personally, one of the most memorable events that I have with Gene and Gay, and I know it was a major event in their life, is when we went together 10 years ago to Israel. What an incredible trip it was. We looked at as many sites as possible. I like to say we didn't walk where Jesus walked, we ran where Jesus walked, and that was needful. But in those 10 days, to have privilege to bond together and faith together, that swelled up within us a fresh love for God and for our Savior. We walked the Via Dolorosa together on the streets of Jerusalem, stood on the banks of the Sea of Galilee. Never forget when we congregated together and we shared verses that were meaningful to us out of the Sermon on the Mount as we were on the Mount of Beatitudes, and then taking communion at the empty tomb. He was a faithful man. It really identifies his life. It's a quality that makes his homecoming glorious because he was the man who would hear, "Well done, thy good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of the Lord." Bob, would you come at this time and share some personal remarks about your dad?
I'm sure glad I do not have to follow one of those tear-jerking songs. It's so special to have Travis Black up here, a family member, and with a wonderful voice. My mom and I would like to thank all of you for being here today. From our family to you, thank you so much. My dad's brother Doyle and my dad's sister Dorothy are both sick themselves. They wanted to be here. Both were able to come up when my dad was in the hospital the last few weeks. His brother Doyle came up here 2 times. His brother Doyle told me how they spent in high school, how they slept in the same bed in those days. So I told Doyle when my dad was in the hospice, "Why don't you just jump in bed with Dad? He would really enjoy it." They're sorry they're not here, and we're sorry they're not here, but keep them in your prayers, as it tears them apart not to be part of the celebration of their older brother, a brother they love deeply. Your love and your prayers have been felt all week by my family and by myself, and so I thank you for that. As we find ourselves here on a Saturday morning, it's a little bit ironic, and I'll let you in on the inside joke. For years, my dad has tried to have me speak before the Retired Officers Association. As you've gathered, my dad was very proud of his military career, and he should have been. 40 years. He made colonel through the Army Reserves. That's hard to do. It's much easier to become a colonel in the active military, much harder in the Army Reserves. My dad never let his brother forget that. His brother Doyle also is a colonel. He was active military for his entire career. So a little bit of a rivalry there. But getting back to how ironic it is that I'm speaking before you on a Saturday morning, for years my dad wanted me to speak to the Retired Officers Association to tell them about the FBI. And he thought they'd be very interested to hear more about the FBI. But they always met once a month, and it was always on a Saturday morning. And for years, I told my dad, I said, Dad, you know, the last thing I really want to do after working all week is to get up and give a speech on a Saturday morning. Well, I think my dad's having the last laugh on me right now as we are here on a Saturday morning. As you heard from the pastor, my name is Bob Herndon, and I'm Gene Herndon's son. As my dad would tell people, I'm his oldest son, and I'm his youngest son, and I'm his favorite son. My dad maybe didn't tell everyone that I'm an only child, but he was very proud of me, and I was very proud of him. What I want to talk about now is that it's such an honor to be here to talk about my dad, and this should be a celebration. This is a man who lived 80 full years. Certainly the last 3 weeks have been very painful as cancer took over his body quickly, unexpectedly, and led to a quick end. But for 80 years, my dad had a great life, a great man. It was so wonderful to see many of you in the hospital the last 3 weeks, to meet you last night, to hear the stories about what a good man he was. I don't presume to know the man that you knew. Some of you knew my dad as a colonel. Some of you knew my dad as a vice president of a large international company. Some of you knew my dad as a volunteer at St. Joseph Hospital for 14 years. And some of you knew my dad as a neighbor. Of course, I knew my dad as a loving man, as a great dad. But I think if all of us were to write down on a piece of paper the characteristics that define Gene Herndon, I think our list would be very similar. My dad was the same man, as the saying goes, on a Saturday night as he was on Sunday morning. There's not many people that can say that, but that's how he led his life. I never heard my dad say a cuss word, even though I gave him plenty of opportunities to cuss. A true gentleman all the time. A patient man, very patient. As the family, the kids and I, my mom and I, as we started to go through my dad's things and prepare for this service, I had a chance to go back to his college yearbooks. And I wish I would have done this when my dad was still alive, because now I have lots of questions for him. As we found out, my dad had a little bit of a nerd in him. Most people in their college yearbooks have 1 or 2 clubs that they belong to. My dad had at least 8 to 10, and they weren't the most exciting clubs. My dad was a member of the chemistry club, the biology club. He was in the band, the yearbook, the business club, the commercial club, and the all-exciting economics club. My dad was also a member of the rifle team. Yep. My dad was also a member of the rifle team and also the ROTC. I have no idea how he had time to meet my mom because he was so busy. On top of all those clubs, my dad also had 3 jobs. He sold shoes, he worked in a hardware store, and he worked at the soda fountain. But somehow he met the love of his life in college, and they got married while they were in college, and they've been married for 60 years. And 60 wonderful years. My dad honored my mom and loved her so much. My dad loved this country so much also. He honored it and he believed in its foundation. My dad firmly believed that our country was founded on godly principles, and he was a man of God. My dad listened to 5 songs continuously for his last 48 hours on earth. And those songs are the ones you're hearing today in today's service. And my dad believed in rules, and he believed that everyone he met was special. Now, maybe there's an exception to that. My dad did not like Democrats. And so if I'm being truthful, I have to say that. My wife and I, we took the steps of carefully telling our 2 oldest as they turned 18 how important it was to carefully study the candidates, how important it was to understand the issues. And as parents, we fully supported them to vote with their heart and with their minds. It didn't matter if a person was a Republican or a Democrat. This was a well thought out plan by intellectual parents, we thought. My dad heard this conversation and said, "That's nonsense." It takes my dad 30 seconds to vote. And he told my son and my oldest daughter, he said, "All you do is you look for the R. Vote R, 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 and then you're done." My dad was also concerned that a female who was a Democrat may sweep up my son someday. So he was fond to tell my son not to let some liberal woman off the street marry you. He'd tell my two daughters, he'd say, "Hey, here's my advice for you. Always clean your plate and don't get married until you're 30. I want you to get an education and get a job first." And I always thought that was ironic coming from a man who got married in college, but he was always concerned about his grandkids. When I look back at my dad's life and I think about words like honor and respect, I certainly think about the word love. My dad had an unconditional love for all of us. And for the people in this room, you know what I mean. It doesn't matter your walk of life, he loved you. He loved transporting people at St. Joseph Hospital. He did that for 14 years. Even when he came down with pulmonary fibrosis, he still wanted to push that cart. He was on 4 liters of oxygen, which would keep most people at home, and he still worked hard to report every Wednesday for his volunteer job. An unconditional love. Pastor Steve mentioned that there may be an exception to my dad's unconditional love, and that would be Ned Yost. My dad and his close friend, Alan Buzzard, these two men would watch Royals games together at their separate homes, and they would text one another like teenage girls. And my mom would make fun of them all the time, as she should. "What are you guys doing?" And they're texting back and forth about all the moves that Ned Yost is not making, all the wrong moves he kept making. And now, truth be told, my dad loved Ned Yost and loves the Royals, but he always had a strong thought about how things should be done. And he'd let the pastors know, I'm sure, you know, the way he saw things growing up as a Southern Baptist down in Arkansas. One of my dad's last nights on this earth, he and I spent watching the Royals game, and at this point in time, my dad was heavily under the influence of some strong pain medication. The cancer had spread to his bones, and he was in immense pain. But he wanted to watch the Royals game. He wanted to watch it with me. And we sat there watching the game, and my dad dozed in and out of consciousness. Every so often, he'd wake up, and I'd give him a quick update. This particular game, the score was tied late in the game. Mr. Buzzard had been texting my dad, and I read your text messages. They brought in Joaquim Soria. And I told my dad this, and my dad starts saying, "No, no, no, no." And anybody walking by out in the hall would have thought maybe my dad was going to see his maker. He was just mad at the move that the Royals had just made. My dad was a fan to the end, and he was a fan of all of us. My dad never met a stranger, and when I was little, this really bothered me, because everywhere we met, my dad would work me into the conversation. "Hey, let me introduce you to my son." And you know, when we're little kids, we don't like that. And as I got older, I knew what to expect. And now, I certainly appreciate his efforts. My dad, of course, left the military life and had a very successful civilian life. He gained over 1 million miles on American Airlines and was at 900,000 on Delta. He flew the world. His boss was in England. He'd tell me that's a great thing, usually, to have a boss 6 to 8 hours away. But he had many trips overseas. My dad would always come back from his trips and tell me about the person he met in the plane. I always pitied that person for having to listen to my dad nonstop. But again, my dad never met a stranger. Surprisingly, I don't know how he did it, but somehow, even though my dad traveled a lot, my dad was there at almost all my baseball games. And he made an effort to come in, and many times he showed up in a suit and tie, and he'd be in the dugout because he was our scorekeeper. We called him Scoop Herndon. Sometimes he'd even show up with a pipe, and here he'd be dressed to the nines with a pipe, keeping score. My dad was very friendly to all the players. He loved all the boys. My dad had a philosophy: if the ball hit the bat, that's a hit. So we had a whole team one year that had batting averages over 500, because my dad was a very friendly scorekeeper. All this to say that my dad was a homer. My dad loved people, and the people in his life knew that he loved them and he cared for them. My dad worshiped my 3 kids, his 3 grandkids. He thought that Emily was the best soccer player in the world. He thought Matt was the best baseball player. And he thought little Katie was the best dancer. He went to all of their events, even in his late stages of pulmonary fibrosis. I can still see my dad walking those hills of UMKC, and then walking up into the stands to take his seat, huffing and puffing. My dad insisted on buying season tickets because he wanted to support the program. My daughter could have gotten him in for free, but he wanted the program to have some extra money. My dad, when my kids came off the playing field or off the dance floor, my dad would look at them and hug them, and he'd tell each of them, "You were the very best. You were the best one." He was full of sincerity, and he truly believed it in his heart that his grandkids were perfect, that they were truly the best one. And I think today we'd like to say to my dad, to our papa, to my mom's husband, to Gene Herndon, we'd like to say, Dad, in our eyes, you were the very best one. Thank you.